I told my mother-in-law, who tried to use my bank book without permission. I will give you that bank book, so please feel free to use it. My husband and mother-in-law, who took it at face value, would experience hell. My name is Violet. I am a 30-year-old employee at a company. I live with my husband Joe, whom I married 2 years ago. My husband is a kind and nice man, but he's under the influence of his nearby living mother-in-law, who often causes trouble. My mother-in-law lives alone in her parents-in-law's house. She comes to our house every day to take care of my husband, and my husband relies on her for everything. My mother-in-law also takes care of my husband's laundry, and she cooks meals for both her husband and herself, and they enjoy eating together. However, my mother-in-law never stays overnight at our house. Whenever my husband is at home, his mother-in-law is also there. In this situation, instead of feeling like I'm married to my husband, I feel like I'm witnessing the close relationship between my husband and his parents. Before getting married, my husband, who had always said, "I won't live with my mother-in-law," but his mother has been coming over almost every day. Frustrated, I vented my dissatisfaction to my husband. "You said we wouldn't live with your mother, but this is practically the same as cohabitating." In response to these words, my husband looked surprised and replied, "Why are you so angry? We're not living together just because we're under the same roof." It was futile to say anything to my husband, who considered sharing the same roof and sleeping under it as living together. My mother-in-law doesn't openly bully me, but she constantly uses things in our house and eats them without permission, which is frustrating. She cooks meals for my husband, so I can tolerate her using ingredients for that purpose, but it's a problem when she takes leftover ingredients to her parents' house. She takes all the ingredients from the refrigerator, even the newly bought rice, carrying them all in bags to her parents' house. Since I bought those ingredients with my own money, I ask her to return them, but says, "Oh, these are the things you bought for Joe, right? Since I'm the one cooking anyway, it's fine for me to take them to my house." She said it as if it were obvious. I was disgusted and replied firmly, "Well, what am I supposed to eat then?" With a smirk, my mother-in-law laughed and said, "Oh, that's right. Do you also need to eat, don't you?" Her intentionally contrived expression made me furious. I was also angry with my mother-in-law, but I became even more dissatisfied with my husband, who always takes her side. Since I strongly objected to the issue of ingredients, I haven't openly brought back all the ingredients to my in-laws' house since then, but they frequently use my things without permission. The other day, as it was getting cold, I searched the closet to put on my down jacket soon, but I couldn't find it anywhere. Thinking that I might have left it at the dry cleaners, I found my mother-in-law wearing my down jacket when she came to our house. "Mother-in-law, that's my down jacket, isn't it?" When I asked, my mother-in-law, wearing a loose-fitting and ill-fitting down jacket, smiled with a satisfied expression. It seemed warm, so I borrowed it. "It suits me perfectly. Can I continue wearing it like this?" Even though my mother-in-law is smaller than me, it seems too big on her, but she liked it so much that she didn't return it to me. It's fine for her to use my things, but if she just told me, I would be okay with it. But, instead, my mother-in-law uses other people's belongings without saying a word. I didn't like her taking liberties with my food and clothes, but her actions continued to escalate even further. Recently, there was a misfortune in my relatives. I prepared to offer condolences by putting money in a mourning envelope, but when I was about to leave for the funeral, the contents of the envelope were gone. I hurriedly asked my husband, "Do you know what happened to the money in the mourning envelope that was here?" "I'm certain I put it in there." Before my husband could answer, my mother-in-law, who had come to visit that day, casually said, "I took that money. If you leave it in a place like that, it'll be stolen by thieves. You're the thief." I wanted to yell back like that, but I held my composure and replied to my mother-in-law, I need that money now. Could you please return it?" While glaring at me, my mother-in-law said grumpily, "Why should I return it? It's already in my possession, so it's mine." My mother-in-law always says, and if something belongs to someone else but is in her possession, she never returns it. The husband who was present there also sided with his mother-in-law and argued against me. It should be fine like that. It's not a significant amount of money. Certainly, as distant relatives, the condolence money in the envelope was only $20, but it didn't change the fact that he took my money, and I just couldn't accept it. While my husband and I were arguing, my mother-in-law went home, so I clearly said to my husband, "Even if she's your mother-in-law, isn't taking someone else's money considered stealing? You should tell your mother-in-law that too." Unusually, I spoke with conviction, and my husband was overwhelmed, but he immediately defended his mother. "We're family, so don't use words like stealing. Mom is also struggling financially, so please be lenient with her. My mother-in-law lives off the money she earns from her part-time job and the survivor's pension from her deceased husband a few years ago. Most of the meals are eaten at our house, so it shouldn't cost much, and it seemed like my husband gives her money every month, so I thought they were reasonably comfortable. My husband, despite assisting my mother-in-law with money, contributes only a small amount to our household expenses. To be honest, I have been living solely on my salary. Originally, my husband's income was lower than mine, so I thought I would have to shoulder a greater burden to some extent, but I never imagined that I would have to rely entirely on my salary. From that time on, I started to question whether it was okay for me to continue living with my husband. At that moment, another incident occurred that puzzled me even more. When I returned home from work, I was surprised to see my husband and mother-in-law engaged in a serious discussion with a visitor. Observing their serious faces as they listened attentively to a man in a suit explaining something, I had an uneasy feeling for some reason. Since we had never had such visitors before, I became anxious, suspecting that the two of them were plotting something improper. After the visitor left, I cautiously asked my husband about it, filled with fear. "Who is that person right now?" They were speaking with serious expressions. What were they talking about? For a moment, my husband looked puzzled, but immediately my mother-in-law answered, "It's someone from a housing company. We're thinking of buying a new house." To my mother-in-law, who suddenly mentioned buying a house, I asked in return, "Are you going to rebuild your childhood home? Since my in-laws' house is quite old, it might be a good idea to rebuild it, but I wanted to know where the money would come from." Considering how my mother-in-law is the type to steal condolence money I had prepared, it seemed unlikely that she had any funds for rebuilding a house. However, my mother-in-law said something unexpected. "That house is a rental. We're not rebuilding it. We're planning to buy a newly built house." I was surprised by my mother-in-law's calm demeanor. From her tone, it seemed like she already had the funds prepared to buy a new house, and I couldn't help but wonder if I had been deceived by my mother-in-law all this time. Taking food and money from my home was not because I was struggling to make a living, but simply because I was stingy, and I didn't want to spend my own money, I realized. Even the assistance I received from my husband was for the purpose of saving my own part-time earnings and my late father-in-law's survivor's pension. However, thinking about it that way, it becomes frustrating. In the end, it seems that I was helping my mother-in-law purchase a new house, which is not amusing. At the same time, without saying anything, I became even more furious with my husband, who was assisting my mother-in-law. And I glared at him as if it were someone else's problem. My husband seemed unaware of why I was glaring at him, and he hastily said, "Why are you glaring at me? I have nothing to do with it, right?" Despite claiming to have nothing to do with it, he was discussing with the housing manufacturer together with my mother-in-law, which implies that he intends to live with her in the new house. I didn't want to express my dissatisfaction in front of my mother-in-law, so I kept it to myself, but she spoke up first. "When the new house is built, let's live together, Violet. Thanks to you, we can afford to buy a newly constructed house." Being told that it was thanks to me, I realized that from the beginning, the purpose was to buy a house. If I continue talking to my mother-in-law and husband like this, I feel like I'll lose my temper, so I left the two of them and returned to my room. As I changed clothes and calmly thought about it, I began to wonder if it was possible to buy a newly constructed house with the amount of money my husband assisted with. After all, he only assists about $1,000 per month, and my mother-in-law's part-time job pays only a few $100s per month. It's possible that my father-in-law left behind a considerable inheritance, but he passed away before I got married, so it's unclear how much the inheritance he left. From observing my mother-in-law's lifestyle, it doesn't seem like there's a significant amount left, but considering my stingy mother-in-law, she might have been hiding it from me. Moreover, for me, the prospect of living with my mother-in-law in a newly built house was a major issue, more so than the source of money. Even in the current situation, it's already close to the limit, and if we live together, it seems like she would use all my belongings, and I wouldn't have to bear any living expenses. The house we, as a married couple, currently live in is a rental, but if the newly built house is in my mother-in-law's name, she would likely make sarcastic remarks like, "I'm letting you live here." Of course, all the household chores would be pushed onto me, and considering that, I don't want to live together. My feelings toward my husband were also growing apart, and I had started seriously considering divorcing him. Afterward, the representatives from the housing manufacturer often came to our house to have meetings with my mother-in-law and husband, and it seemed like the discussions were progressing smoothly. I didn't want to be involved, so I didn't participate in the discussions. However, as the housing manufacturer's representative who had finished the meeting with my mother-in-law and others were leaving, they approached me and whispered something in a low voice. "Madam, there's something I'd like to ask you. Do you have a moment?" As my husband and mother-in-law excitedly examine the blueprint of our newly built house, they are completely oblivious to the conversation between me and the representative from the housing company. It's about the funds for constructing the house. "Madam, it has been arranged for you to bear the burden. Do you consent to it?" Taken aback by this sudden statement, I widen my eyes and ask in disbelief, What are you talking about?" The representative then shows me a copy of a document. It's a copy of my savings passbook, showing a balance of $500,000. Even the cover of the passbook was copied. In that instant, I grasped the general idea of my husband and mother-in-law's plan. I responded vaguely to the representative, "Well, that passbook is indeed mine. What about it?" The representative answers with a relieved expression. "That's a relief." I was a bit worried since the lady who would bear the financial burden doesn't participate in any of the meetings. The two always discuss things and say she'll pay in a lump sum once the house is completed. I say to the representative, "Don't worry, they will pay in a lump sum, so please don't be concerned." As I watch the representative happily leave, I feel anger welling up inside me, and I make up my mind to seriously consider parting ways with these two. The savings passbook that appeared in the copy held by the person in charge was indeed mine, which I had stored away deep in the back of the closet, thinking I wouldn't use it. Right after getting married, my father passed away, and I temporarily transferred all of his inheritance to my account, using that passbook at the time. While my mother-in-law and husband were excitedly looking at blueprints, I checked inside the closet and, as expected, couldn't find the passbook. The personal seal that was kept together with it was also missing, so I think she took it, mistaking it for the seal for the passbook. Since it was a passbook I didn't use, I had stored it away, but it's terrifying to think that my mother-in-law searched this far. The fact that she searched this deep makes me feel like all of my belongings were thoroughly examined, sending shivers down my spine, and I'm amazed by her persistence. Although my mother-in-law struggled to find the passbook, it was a passbook that couldn't be used. When inheriting my father's inheritance, the heirs were me, my younger brother, and my mother, so for the time being, I deposited all the cash into my account and later transferred it to my brother's and mother's accounts. At that time, the bank employee recommended a web passbook to me at the counter, so I switched from a paper passbook to a web passbook. According to the bank employee's explanation, with a web passbook, there's no need for a personal seal, there is no risk of the passbook being stolen, and with the smartphone app, I could check my balance anytime, as they said. Since my father unexpectedly left a significant inheritance, I had concerns about managing the passbook, so I followed the bank employee's advice and switched to a web passbook. Afterward, I distributed my father's inheritance to my mother and brother. Recently, my stepmother has been taking my belongings without permission, so I realized later that it was a good decision to switch to a web passbook back then. I couldn't use the paper passbook anymore, but I couldn't bring myself to throw it away, for some reason. The last entry in the passbook was precisely when the balance was at its highest, $500,000. My stepmother, who found the passbook, must have been delighted. Coincidentally, the unused personal seal was also stored together. If there were both the passbook and the personal seal in the back of the closet, it wouldn't be surprising for her to misunderstand that I had kept them safe. Simultaneously, without saying a word to me, my husband and mother-in-law, who are trying to purchase a new house using someone else's savings without permission, I felt it was the perfect timing for revenge. Afterward, I refrained from discussing the finances, and instead, I coldly watched my husband and mother-in-law as they happily celebrated the purchase of the new house. Unaware of anything, my husband and mother-in-law had signed a contract with a housing manufacturer, so I decided to ask them, "Are you perhaps relying on my savings to finance the purchase of the new house?" I suddenly brought it up. And while my husband was flustered, my mother-in-law answered with a smile, "The wife's money is everyone's in the family. It's only natural, so don't ask such things." With a smile that could rival my mother-in-law's, I retorted, "I'll give you that passbook. Please feel free to use it as you." My husband, who I thought would get angry, was taken aback, so I also said to him, "I can't live with you anymore. Please divorce me." Immediately, I confronted my husband with the divorce papers I had prepared. In place of my shaken husband, it was my mother-in-law who spoke up. "Just because we're getting divorced doesn't mean I'll return that bank book. I told you I wouldn't give it back, and now it's too late," she said with a malicious expression. Ignoring my mother-in-law's spiteful glare, I had my husband sign the divorce papers, and I left the house with the papers and the packed belongings I had prepared. Returning to my parents' home, I explained the whole situation to my mother and brother. As expected, they were both angry, but for me, I was looking forward to what would happen between my husband and mother-in-law from now on. Despite signing a contract to purchase a new house, thinking they had $500,000, in reality, they only had an unusable bank book and couldn't withdraw a single cent. I wonder how they'll manage future payments. About half a year after the divorce, I received a panicked phone call from my ex-husband. "Violet, I can't use that bank book anymore for some reason. And it seems like the seal is different too. What's going on?" Suppressing my laughter, I calmly pretended and replied, "Well, that paper bank book, I switched to an online bank account, so it's no longer usable. Besides, there are only about $100,000 left in that account. Why would I let you, my ex-husband, use it?" Seemingly in a great rush or confusion, my ex-husband couldn't comprehend what I was saying, and instead, his mother picked up the phone. "We have to pay for the new house. Bring the money quickly." Facing the heated ex-mother-in-law, I coldly retorted, "I said I would give you the bank book, but I never said I would give you money. Why should I have to bring the money?" On the other end of the phone, I could hear the ex-mother-in-law's frustration, but all that came through was a growling sound. After hanging up, I turned off my smartphone and never answered any more calls from my ex-husband. The newly built house was completed, and when it came time for payment, the couple finally learned the fact that their passbook was unusable. The ex-husband returned to his parents' house, taking on multiple part-time jobs, in addition to his main occupation, to come up with the money for the house purchase. It seems that the ex-mother-in-law also increased her part-time work, but the repayment progress is slow. Since the responsible person didn't properly check the passbook, they might be held accountable by the company. To make matters worse, the ex-husband's part-time jobs were exposed, and it seems he lost his job as well. For the two of them who stole things without permission and tried to use them only for themselves, it's just desserts. The two part-time workers are burdened with a large amount of debt and have reached a desperate situation. Having returned to my parents' house, I live leisurely without worrying about my belongings being stolen by my mother-in-law. I am grateful to the bank clerk who advised me to switch to a web passbook. If I had stayed with the paper passbook, by now, my father's inheritance might have been used without permission. However, the panic in their voices over the phone was truly laughable. It's so delightful that it can wash away the frustration of 2 years of marriage life.